Do you remember years ago, if you've read any history, and you know I love history, about 150 or 200 years ago, there was an invention that started in Europe, came to the United States, called the railroad. The railroad. Now, the railroad to us now is just something that we all understand and know. In America, the railroad is just for sending goods primarily, except a few routes. In other parts of the world, like Europe, it's a great place for people to move. It's an incredible, they have bullet trains and they have the Eurail passes and all these things. It's wonderful. But they had a problem about 150 years ago with the railroad. And when they started with the railroads, it was only moving people. There was an engine, a couple of cars of people, and then a caboose, right? The typical thing. Children played with models of this. But when the Industrial Revolution occurred, then they started moving goods. And they were moving manufactured goods from one place to another, to another, to another. And they developed these multiple tracks. Before, it was just one track. It went through the communities. One went north, one went east and west, and they only had 2 or 3 tracks, and you knew what was on it. But then they started making these multiple tracks, especially when you went into towns. If you've ever been to Chicago, to the stockyards in Chicago, it's amazing. There's probably 15 tracks. And the cars would come in, the engine with all the cars, and then the cars that needed to stay in that city would be moved off to one track, and then they would pick up other cars, railway cars I'm speaking of, and you would see them. And it was just an amazing thing. But they had a problem when they did this. They were leaving cars behind, railway cars. They weren't quite sure how to make sure they had, because there were no cabooses anymore. It was just a matter of picking up 5 cars, dropping off 5 cars, and these things are, about 100 railway cars long nowadays. So they didn't know if they had it. So they did something very ingenious and very, very simple. At the last car that was supposed to be on the railway for that part of the trip, they would put something on the last car. Do you know what they would put? They would put this, if I could bring it out. They would put a red lantern on the last car. So the conductor would come out, and the engineer would come out, and he would count the cars, and then he would see this lantern on the last one, and then he would go and make a motion. Way back, they didn't have the radios. He would make a motion to the driver to say, you can go because the last car is hooked on. If he didn't see this red lantern, they knew they were missing cars. Just something very simple. And it was done for years and years. Now they have electronics and they have two-way radios and they know exactly, and it's all done by computer. But it wasn't that way for about 100 years. Well, there was a sporting event that had the same problem. One of my favorite sporting events. It started at the turn of the last century, about 1900 or 1901. It's my favorite sporting event of the year. It's called the Tour de France. Are you familiar with the Tour de France? It's a bike race. It's a bike race that goes 2,000 miles around France and the countries, Belgium, Netherlands, sometimes into Switzerland, and always into Spain. And they do this race. Well, years ago, before they would close the roads, they would have the race, and everybody had their own tires, their own repair kits, and they would say, your job is to get to this town, which was 100 miles away, and then they would count the clock, and then the next day you would do the next, and the next day you would do the next. Well, they didn't close the roads, and they never knew who was in the race and who was not in the race, and who was at the end of the race, because people were riding their bikes alongside as well. So they devised what they called the Lanterne Rouge, which is French for the red lantern. And for those that were in the back of the pack, that might be many minutes behind the main pack, they gave them, not this, but they put them on their backs, a picture of a red lantern to show that they were in the race. And actually, at the end of every race, all the way to this year, the person who comes in last place gets a red lantern. Now, the guys who win it gets hundreds of thousands of dollars and these crystal things, but and they are proud of this because they finished the race. You see, the red lantern showed that they were in the race and they finished the race. And many times I think we as Christians are only looking at those who are at the front of the race. And we're only looking at the leaders who are at the front of the race. And to realize that it's not that you finish first, but it's that you finish. That you are even in the race to begin with. Paul talks about the race and that he has finished the race at the end of his life. And my question is, do you have a lanterne rouge on your spiritual back? Are you even in the race?